Welcome, everyone, to Tree Saps and Syrups with Seed St. Louis. I am Dean Gunderson, the Chief Program Officer here. And I will be talking to you about trees and the wonderful food that you can get from them in the middle of winter whenever there's really nothing else to eat. So first, kind of what are tree saps? So tree sap is the fluid that comes out of a tree when it is injured, if the conditions are right. Sap does not flow all of the time. Even like trees that we're going to be talking about that you're getting sap from, if you tap them in July, you're not going to get any sap. The conditions need to be just right for it to happen. And that's why we're talking about it now, so that you have time to get ready, so that you can do it when that right time comes. So this sap that comes out of the tree is mostly water, like almost entirely water. But it also contains all of the nutrients that that tree needs and is producing, that it needs to move around its tissue. That's how it moves around its tissue. It's kind of like our blood to some degree, and that it's kind of the fluid that are like minerals, nutrients, and things are moving through, that we are basically tapping into and harvesting. The minerals that it contains are mostly calcium, potassium, silica, manganese, and sodium, but it has trace amounts of everything a tree needs. And it also contains sugar to very varying degrees. Trees can be anywhere, the sap of a tree can be anywhere from 0.2% sugar to 10% sugar, depending on the species and the individual tree within that species, and the environmental factors that those trees are growing in and are experiencing in any season. When the sugar content is brought up, when you take a sap and you do something to make the sugar content reach a minimum of 66%, it becomes shelf stable. It has enough sugar that microorganisms can't survive in it anymore. And so it becomes shelf stable. And that is what we call syrup. That is what maple syrup and things like that are, is simply the sap that has been altered in some way to make that sugar concentration go from, 2% to 66%, so that you can have it on a shelf and it doesn't mold or ferment or, get slimy or nasty, which is what happens if you have just raw sap that you leave sitting out. So what is it good for? What are we talking about? A lot of times syrup is what people are talking about, and they think that that's kind of the only thing that it is useful for. But sap is actually really interesting in its own right. So the sap of these trees that we're going to be talking about is sterile when it comes out of the tree. And so it can be consumed directly, as long as the materials that it's touching as it comes out of the tree are also not contaminated and things like that. But you can also, cook it or something to make sure that it's sterile. Maple and walnut sap, and that's any maple species and any walnut species, are slightly sweet. Like when you drink them, it just kind of tastes sweet. Birch is not. Birch is another one. Sorry, let me just come back here. Okay, sorry. Yeah, this new computer's weirding me out. So birch sap really doesn't taste sweet at all. The sugar concentration of birch sap is very, very low. And so birch sap mostly just tastes like the purest, freshest water you've ever had in your life. It's just an incredibly crisp, clean water taste, but it does have sugar in it. It's just very low, and so it's not usually noticeable. So because of their mineral content, mostly, saps have often been consumed as is, as like a spring tonic. So, in the spring, whenever you've kind of been dragging through the winter, before our industrial food system where you can get any food you want any time of year that can just, be flown in from halfway across the planet. In the winter, people mostly ate stuff that wasn't that great, or stuff that was not at least like fresh, bright, mineral dense things. It was mostly like a lot of tubers, a lot of roots, a lot of meat, a lot of grain. There wasn't a lot of like fresh fruits and vegetables that were being consumed. And so something fresh and full of minerals was appealing, and sweet was appealing. And so it was consumed in the spring, just like people would drink it, or they would cook with it, just as like the water component of a soup or a dish or something like that. And the people of northern Eurasia, so Europe and Asia, and northern China have consumed birch sap for at least centuries, if not longer. The people of Korea consume maple sap, and the name of the maple tree in Korea, literally, like the translation into English, the literal translation means good for the bones, which makes sense when you consider that the minerals contained in it are silica, potassium, calcium, magnesium, which are kind of like the main components of bone. It was also harvested on an industrial scale, which is what this picture is. This is from East Germany during the Soviet era, where it was like produced and harvested on industrial scales, the sap. And the sap was mostly used as kind of the water component to make alcohol. And I haven't been able to figure out exactly why, but logically it would make sense to me that if you ferment it into an alcohol, it then becomes shelf stable, and you then have these minerals, some of which are hard to get, all year long, as opposed to just during the couple weeks that they are running. So then we come to syrup. So, you can use sap, you can drink it, you can cook with it, you can do things like that. But for the most part, what people want to do is make it into syrup. So maple syrup, as far as I can tell, and everything I've read, really the only place in the world where tree sap was boiled down to syrup was in what is now the northeastern US and southeastern Canada. The indigenous people of that region of the world, as far as I can tell, basically invented tree syrups. And they did that with maples. And that's why that part of, or one of the reasons why that part of the world is still the main place where you are producing those tree syrups. And I think for the most part, we all know what to do with maple syrup. It's great adding into all sorts of different things. And it is also an interesting fact here. It is also probably the most sustainable sweetener. There were studies that were done that have found that each gallon of maple syrup that is produced leads to 100 to 255 pounds of CO2 being sequestered, because you get more sap the older a tree gets. And so when people buy maple syrup, you are creating an economic incentive for someone somewhere to leave old growth maple forests there and to tend them and to make sure that they don't burn down or get killed by insects or bulldozed for a housing development or something like that, because those trees have a direct economic value as living old growth trees. And so that's pretty cool. It's literally like a carbon negative food, which is pretty sweet. No pun intended. And this is just an interesting picture that I found was here that was of an indigenous woman who was harvesting sap from a maple tree. So you can see where they made like cuts in the bark, and they stuck these little wood pieces in there to kind of direct the sap out. And then they're collecting it in these little birch bark baskets. So, people have been doing this a long time. And thankfully, they developed this so that we can all enjoy maple syrup because it's delicious. So tree tapping, which is what you need to do to get the sap out of the tree in a harvestable form, at least, is the intentional, conscientious, and carefully executed process of wounding a tree so that the sap can be collected from that wound. And I added all those intentional, conscientious, and carefully because you are injuring the tree, and I think we all want to be good stewards of those trees. And so we're gonna talk about things. You want to make sure that your things are clean, that you're not introducing pathogens, that you're not producing more damage than is absolutely needed, things like that. And it involves drilling a hole and putting a spout into the hole, which is a way to keep the wound and sap safe and sanitary. And then you're using a vessel of some kind to collect the sap that is dripping out of that wound. This should always be done in a careful way with focus on protecting the health and integrity of that tree. If for no other reason, because if you damage the tree too much this year, you're not going to get sap ever again from it. So, you want to make sure that, you're following some general procedures, which we'll talk about. This is not at all hard to do, but you do want to know what you're doing. And just to show you too, that this is a thing that can be done in a way that is not causing permanent damage to the tree. So you can see this bucket over here is one. This is a tree that I have tapped the last 3 years. So you can see this bucket hanging here. So there's a hole up here that is dripping into this bucket. But this right here is where I tapped it 2 years ago. So you can see it's already pretty much healed over, but you can see kind of that half circle shape is kind of what's left in the bark, but you can see the actual hole has healed over. And this is where I tapped it 2 years ago, or three years ago, down here. And you can, you know, if I wasn't pointing at it, you probably wouldn't be able to point it out. Like, and this tree is fine, it's healthy, it's continued to grow every year. So tappable trees, so trees that you can actually tap. A lot of times when you look into this, what people are talking about is sugar maples. And the reason for that is that sugar maples do have the highest yield. And so they are the ones that, from an economic standpoint, are the ones that are focused on, because they are the ones that have kind of the biggest return on investment in terms of that. But if you're just talking about it as a hobby or a fun thing to do or an educational experience, there are so many different trees you can tap. So maples, you can tap literally any species of maple. So that includes sugar maples, but also the invasive Norway maple. Please don't plant any of them. But if you already have one or someone has one and they don't want to get rid of it, you can tap the Norway maple, the black maple, the red maple, the silver maple, and box elder is a type of maple. That's actually what this maple is here in this picture that I tapped. It is a box elder, and it's a box elder that's literally growing out of a crack in concrete. Like, you know, box elders are very weedy trees, but they still produce beautiful sap and syrup. You can also tap birch. You can tap river birch, and paper birch are really kind of the only two that we grow around here. River birch is really the only one that grows well around here, but both of those are tappable. And then walnuts. Again, kind of black walnut is the main one that is tapped here, and it does produce a syrup. Maples, birches, and walnuts are a little bit different in how they're done, which we'll talk about. But these are the ones that, like, if you're like, I want an intro, these are the ones that you can do with pretty low tech things. So sugar, Norway, and black maples are all around 2% sugar or higher in terms of their sap content, which is good. That sounds really low, and it is, but that's good. All other maples and black walnuts are generally around 1 to 1.5% sugar, and then birch are less than 1% sugar. So some general rules. When you're deciding, you know, if you have trees in your yard, on your property, or somewhere, someone who's willing to let you tap their trees. I tap a lot of trees in other people's yards, with permission, of course. Is you want to make sure that the tree is big enough to support this. This is a stress on the tree. Again, it is a wound that you're inflicting on the tree. And so you don't want to do it to a young tree that's, you know, too immature to handle that stress. You don't want to do it to a tree that's really damaged, something like that. So it needs to be a good size. For basically everything that is on that list, except for box elder and birch trees, you want it to be a minimum of 10-inch diameter. So, you know, diameter is like the width of the trunk. So you can use, you know, tape measure, ruler, whatever you got. You want it to be at least 10 inches wide, like the stem of the tree, the trunk of the tree. For box elder and birch trees, they just don't get as big. And so 8 inches is the minimum diameter for a box elder or a birch. You can start tapping them a little bit smaller. So if your tree is kind of 10 to 20 inch diameter, one tap is as much as you should be putting on there, no more than that. If your trunk diameter is 20 inches or, you know, over 20 inches to like 25 inches, you can do up to 2 taps. You don't need to do 2. 1 is also fine. But you can do up to 2 taps, but again, no more. If your tree is more than 25 inches in diameter, you can do 3 taps. No tree should ever have more than 3 taps, regardless of how big it is. Now, it can get a little dicey with some of these trees, like river birch, where you can see this is actually the same river birch, but it has 2 separate trunks. They're both over 10 inches in diameter, like they're nice big river birch. And so I put 1 on each. If you have one that had, like I have some silver maples down in a creek that have like 5 stems on them. And I'm still usually only tapping 3 of them, but you could potentially do 1 for each stem. But if you've got just one big stem, you don't want to be doing more than 3 at any one time. And then again, trees should be healthy. If a tree is sick or struggling in some way, or is diseased, don't tap it, because then you're just adding to its stress. You're adding to its struggle. So get an arborist out, or, do something, or wait until the tree is looking healthier, happier, doing better, and then you can reevaluate tapping it. But don't add more stress to a tree that is already stressed out. So yield, everyone wants to know, like, well, how much will I get? And unfortunately, as is the case with most things, the answer is it depends, which is not helpful in terms of giving you a number. But it really just does depend. The number of factors is ridiculous, and we don't even really understand them. Like, there's whole university programs that just study maple syrup production, and they still can't even fully answer, like, why does sap run, or when? It's kind of a mystery to some degree. I mean, we know some things about it, but there's still things that pop up where they're just like, I don't know, that was weird. So sugar maples in particular, which is the one that has the most research behind it, the most data behind it, because it is the one that is primarily used on a commercial basis. So there's been the most funded research for it, because there's money to fund it, can have sap concentrations anywhere from 9% all the way up, 2% all the way up to 9%. So that's like, you can plant, like, this is actually a research planting right here. And so, like, in this grove, they have measured, this tree might have 2% and the one next to it might have 9%. They have the exact same environmental conditions. So that's just a genetic thing, seemingly. And then, as we've kind of already talked about, it varies by species. Birch have like less than 1%. Sugar maples have over 2% for the most part. I myself have tapped sugar maples all the way up to like 4.5% around here. And then there's other ones that I've tapped that are like 1% for some reason. And individual trees vary. So just like I'm talking about, like, these individual ones can vary. Some are just naturally sweeter from a genetic standpoint. And also I have some trees that just don't produce at all. Like, I have on some family property, there's a bunch of silver maples, and I've tapped quite a few of them, and some of them produce a lot pretty reliably. And then I've had others that I have tapped 3 years now, just because I want them to work, and I haven't gotten a single drop from that tree in any of the 3 years. While another tree, just like 100 feet away, will produce several gallons per day of sap with just no explanation that I have been able to find out. There are some things that we know can impact it from an environmental standpoint or like structural standpoint. One is that more sun exposure increases the amount of sap and the concentration of sugar, which kind of makes sense. If it's able to photosynthesize more, it's producing more carbohydrates. Sugars are a form of carbohydrate. And also larger crowns produce more sap and higher sugar content. So more larger crowns, as in, these have pretty small crowns, like the leaves are kind of just up there at the top, versus if you have a tree that's like in a yard where it's got, a big rounded crown, there's a lot more leaves, there's a lot more energy, a lot more sugar being produced and moving through the tissues. Another interesting factor that they're doing more and more research on is they are finding that the hotter the summer temperatures during the growing season, the lower the sugar content will be the following winter. So studies in New England have found that every 1 degree Celsius increase in the average summer temperature causes a drop of 0.1% sugar. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but as you're boiling, that can be a lot of extra work. And it's estimated that New England, which is, again, kind of the major maple syrup producing region on the planet, could lose an average of 0.6% sugar content by 2100, just as our summers continue to get hotter. Another figure I've seen has shown that the number of total taps, like in the maple producing, like the syrup producing region of North America, has increased about 2% per year. Like the number of like taps going into trees has increased about 2% per year. But the amount of actual product being produced has been flat for about a decade. So that 2% increase is just making up for the drop in production from the total tree production. So So, there's all these different environmental factors, genetic factors, different things going into it. So a lot of times the answer to yield is tap them and find out. You just don't know. And it varies from year to year. So just another thing to kind of show that. So the first 2 years that I did this, the syrup, like the sap running time was about from MLK Day through kind of mid-March. This, past, January, I tapped on MLK Day again, but the trees were done producing by the 3rd week of February. So it was like a full 3 weeks shorter. So I got a lot less production, even though I tapped the same number of trees, the exact same trees, the same time. But just because of the way that our spring worked out, the time that the sap was running was much shorter. So it depends, unfortunately. Can't give you a hard number. So the equipment that you will need, kind of the first thing that you need to decide or you need to think about is, do you want to use buckets or something like a bucket? So something that like hangs like this, or a milk jug can hang in that same way, or do you want to use tubes? So tubes, would be something like this, either going down to something on the ground, or like what large commercial operations use if you have like a larger property is tubing that then like the tubing all connects, and then you've got a big tube that goes somewhere and dumps into like a big container. If you're talking about just a few trees, just like kind of in your yard in an urban setting, buckets is really is I think the best way to go for various reasons that we'll talk about. But tubes can allow you to have multiple trees collecting into one common container, which can reduce collection time and reduce the number of containers you need to have. But the tubes are not exactly easy to clean and sterilize, at least in a very thorough way, for long term. Like you can maybe do it for a year or two, but eventually you're going to need to be kind of getting new tubing. And the other thing that is, I don't think super common, but can happen, is rodents, particularly squirrels, will sometimes realize what's going on in this tubing, and they'll chew holes in it to try and get to that sweet sap. And then you got to patch that, deal with that situation. Regardless of what type you get, you are going to need to have spiles, which is the name of the tap. So the thing that actually goes into the tree and directs the sap out. But it's important to know, again, whether you like the idea of hanging ones or tubes, because the type of the taps are different. So the tap that you would use for a tube is different than the tap that you would use for a bucket. So if you decide you want buckets, but you get taps for tubes, it's not going to be easy. There's plastic ones, which are much cheaper. And then there's metal ones, which are much more expensive, but the metal ones will basically last forever, as long as something weird doesn't happen or you don't drop them and lose them. And they're easier to clean, in my opinion, because you can just kind of boil them until they're nice and clean and sanitized. There are 3 sizes of spiles, and by sizes we're talking about diameter. So the diameter hole that you need to drill into the tree in order for the spile to fit. So 7/16 inch are the old ones. So if you buy like used spiles online, they're almost certainly going to be the 7/16 inch. Newer ones are 5/16 inch, so they're a little smaller. And that doesn't sound like that big of a difference, but because of, if you go back to geometry, because of the way that areas of circles work, a 5/16 inch hole actually removes half as much wood tissue. So it's producing half the wound size of the tree. But studies that have been done have found that it really only reduces flow by 6%. So again, at least in my opinion, 50% less damage to the tree for 60% less sap, worth it. So that is my preference. The one that I use is from Sapmeister, which is a stainless steel tap that is machined in the US, which I really like. We also now actually sell those and some metal buckets like this up on our website, that you can also buy them directly from the company, obviously. So the other equipment that you will need is, you will need a drill, because you are going to need to drill into the tree, and you will need a drill bit that corresponds with whatever size spile you have. So when you order your spiles, you'll want to know what size you have. And some people find that using, like if you have a 5/16 inch spile. Sometimes people have issues with, especially if you're not real steady with the drill, you might kind of like wobble a little bit and the hole might be a little bigger than the drill bit is exactly. And so you can then have the issue where you pound it in and it maybe leaks. If you have an issue with that, you can bump it down to like a 9/64 inch bit, which is just, a 64th inch smaller kind of thing. And that will usually solve that issue going forward. Like if you do it the first year, you notice they're kind of all leaking, that might be your issue. You're also going to need something to tap the spile into the cut in the tree, the hole in the tree. Ideally a rubber mallet or something similar so that you're not damaging or breaking the spiles. And then you will need whatever the collection device is, whether that's tubing. If you have spiles for tubing and want to do tubing, just make sure you get the right size tubing because they come in the different diameters depending on the diameter of the spile. And like I said, tubing can be used to connect many trees into one line and come to a huge container. It can also just go from a tap straight down to the ground to like a bucket or container sitting on the ground. And then you can also have just kind of the buckets, the hanging buckets, so kind of the traditional collection, or traditional in the modern sense. If you get one of those or something that you're going to hang, and like I said, you can make your own. You can use like small buckets or a milk jug or something. There's lots of kind of designs of ways to do that online. But whatever you decide to use, you're going to want to make sure that it has a lid, which will reduce dust getting into the sap. It also prevents the issue of if it rains and you get a bunch of water in the sap, basically you just throw it away because it's then so low in sugar at that point that it just makes no sense to produce syrup. It also helps reduce the amount of insects, or like if a bird's flying over and poops, it's going to land on the lid instead of in your sap. And also animals. I have found, like with this style lid, where some things can still get in. I did come out one day, took the lid off, and there was a dead mouse floating in it. So having a lid helps prevent as many insects or things from getting into the sap, which is nice. But yeah, there are, you can buy these buckets. And again, we sell these. You can order them online. You can order them used, which is really the best way to do it. But there is also bags. A lot of times when people are just getting started, they want to order these bags that are incredibly cheap, but they're like plastic bags. And so they basically last once and then you have to throw them away, which is, not great because you have to keep buying them. But if you're just wanting to see if you like it, I guess that's a way to go. But like I said, the traditional buckets are my favorite for a couple of reasons. They are metal. These are aluminum. So there are some that are galvanized steel. I wouldn't recommend getting those used, at least, because those can still rust, which is not great. And also some of them have been found to contain lead, which is also not great. Especially if you're thinking lead could get in the sap and then you boil down the sap forever, then the lead concentration actually ends up being pretty high in that syrup. And so the aluminum ones, though, are a little better. They're not going to rust. They don't have that same lead issue. So they basically will last forever. They're ones that are used. So as the industry up in New England and Canada has kind of moved to tubing, there's just like barns full of these that people are kind of reclaiming and then selling. They're easy to clean, again, because they're metal. So like as opposed to like a plastic material, the metal is much easier to clean, get any like off flavors or weird things that could happen out of there, whereas plastic can kind of hold on to those weird flavors or scents or things like that. They're easy to store. They're nice and stackable. They're easy to pour. So, when people get like larger plastic things and it's just a lot harder to kind of gracefully pour like a 5-gallon bucket of liquid than one of these, which is about 2 gallons, and that flared kind of shape, they're pretty easy to pour. And I think they just look nice. Like if you've got them on your trees, I think this looks more aesthetically pleasing than like a milk jug or something. And they are surprisingly cheap, especially if you're buying them used. The new ones are quite expensive. Then when to tap. So, you kind of got know kind of what equipment you're going to need, but then you need to know, like, when are you doing this? Because like I said, it doesn't happen all the time. So maple and walnut sap run at the same time, and they run anytime the temperature is swinging on kind of a daily basis between freezing and not freezing. So that is generally, fall. And then again in, late winter, early spring is when we're getting that, where it's, maybe 40s, 50s during the day, but then is dipping below freezing at night. That is when the sap flows. Exactly why and how much of a temperature swing is up for debate. But that temperature swing is vital to that. That is what is causing that. The faster and higher the temperature gets above freezing, the more sap will flow. And this doesn't necessarily have to be an everyday thing. So if you get below freezing and then it goes above freezing and it stays above freezing for 2 days, it's not like it's just the sap is gonna drip out until 5 p.m. and then stop. It tends to go for like maybe 24 hours or even a little longer. So it doesn't need to be every single day, but you do want to have that kind of weather time where the temperature is kind of going up and down, versus if the temperature is below freezing kind of all the time, or it's only like above freezing for like 3 hours during the day, you're not going to get sap run. It's really that kind of that up and down is what causes that to change. So like I said, that does happen in the fall. So like you could tap them around now, but the fall, the sugar concentration is incredibly low. It really doesn't make any sense to tap trees in the fall to get syrup. And so generally in St. Louis, we are tapping sometime in January. Like I said, I pretty much have taken MLK Day to be the day that I tap trees, partially because it's the day that I'm off work and it's like easy to remember on the calendar of like, this is a day, it's easy to remember. It's like a thing that I like can stick to so that I remember to do it. But you can also look at the weather. If it's MLK Day and you're like, wow, it's going to be below freezing for the next, like the next 10 days on the forecast, then yeah, you don't need to do it that day. You can wait. But that's a good time to kind of look at and like kind of check the weather and be like, is this looking like this? Because that tends to be around the time of year that we get that. And then the sap will continue to run from that time until one of three things stops the sap from flowing. And that is either it stops freezing at night. So, we get into spring, it's not freezing at night regularly anymore. And then the sap isn't going to run anymore out of the spile, out of the wound. The trees bud, like the buds start opening. So when that happens, you will usually still get sap, but the sap will turn kind of a yellowy green color. It'll taste kind of like grass, and it's just not very sweet anymore. So usually it's just not worth it anymore at that point. Or the hole seals up. It is a wound. The tree is going to eventually seal that tissue, and so that can seal up, which is also going to stop the sap flowing. The wound healing usually happens within about 6 to 8 weeks of the injury happening, of the hole being drilled. If for some reason it happens sooner than that, and like the weather is still right, you can kind of re-drill the hole. Like don't drill a new hole, but just kind of with the drill, just kind of stick it in and out of that hole, and it'll kind of scratch off that kind of callus tissue, and then the sap will continue to flow until the weather gets too warm for it again. Birch, on the other hand, is different. So birch sap runs when the temperature is no longer freezing at night. So once the temperature is kind of reliably not freezing on a regular basis, that is the window at which birch starts to run, and will run for about a month from when you tap it. So birch complements maple and walnut pretty well. So for me in particular, as soon as my maple trees are done, like literally the same day, I pull them out of the maple trees and I go stick them in the birch trees that I have. So another thing about birch trees, it makes them a little different. And I'll show you a video in a couple slides of what like a maple or a walnut tree looks like when you tap it. But if you've ever seen a video of it, you probably know where it's like drip, 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 like it's like a very slow drip. So when you first tap birch though, for like the first several days, you don't get a drip, drip, drip. You get this. And so it's important to check your buckets pretty regularly. Like usually for birch, I'm emptying them 2 or 3 times a day for the first like week. Otherwise, they're just overflowing because the sap comes out very, very fast from birch. After about a week, the dripping, kind of the sap flow drops down to about what a maple or walnut run is. But for that first week, it's very quick. Come on. For the tapping process, it's not overly complicated. You do want to clean everything again, just to make sure we're not introducing diseases, pathogens. Kind of clean, with some soap and water, maybe rubbing alcohol, something to kind of sanitize it if the drill bit has been particularly nasty. You want to clean those things. For things like your spiles and your buckets, it's also important to clean those. You want to scrub those with the hottest water that you have and that you can kind of tolerate. If you can avoid it, it's best to kind of not use soap, which sounds weird, but this is particularly if you're using plastic. If you're using the metal, it's not quite as important because it's relatively easy to get all of the soap residue off of metal. But with plastic, again, you can get kind of that absorption a little bit of the flavors. And so if you're using soap, you do want to make extra sure that you rinse it really, really well. So, if your thing is particularly gross and you need to use soap, use soap. But really make sure that you have rinsed it well, because you're taking a sap that is like 2% sugar and you're boiling off like 90+% of the water to get it up to a sugar concentration of 66%. And so if there's just even a little bit of soap in that sap and you boil it down, your syrup's going to taste like soap. And that's not really a great, and that's not a fun day after you go through all of this work. So if you do use soap, again, just make sure that you get it very well rinsed off. Since you, and then for the spiles, you can scrub them definitely if there's any like residue or anything on them, but it's good to boil them. Probably not the plastic ones, but if you have metal ones, you throw them in water, boil them, and that's going to make sure they're nice and sterile, because again, that's what you're going to be sticking directly into the wound. So you don't want to be introducing diseases into that tree. And you don't need to be using like, we're not in an operating room. You don't need to like, be wearing gloves and everything, but just making sure that your stuff is clean. And then get all of your tools ready, and keep them clean. So don't just, like throw them in the back of some dirty thing, put them in something relatively clean so that they're not getting gross. And then for the drill bit, what I really like to do is I like to put a piece of tape or a mark on the drill bit of some kind so that I know what about 1.5 inches of depth is, because that's how deep you're going. We don't want to be going like 3 inches deep, because there's no real value to that. And again, it's additional injury to the tree. So, putting a mark on there so you know what about 1.5 inches is can be helpful. And then the actual tapping process, drill a hole that is 1.5 inches deep. And at a slight angle. So, you don't want to be going straight into the tree, and you don't want to be going like this into the tree. You want to be kind of going like this, because that wound, you want the gravity to pull that sap down the spile and into your bucket or tubing or whatever you're using. So, so do that. And then it is a good idea to do it, at least a couple feet off the ground. Usually kind of at, your arm height, like kind of a comfortable standing height is a good way to go. Because if you do it really low, if you have, animals, particularly rodents, they're going to want to get into that sap, because it's water in winter that they can get that is not frozen, and it's water that has sugar in it. Like it's good stuff. And so you don't want it like sitting way low on the ground. So about your comfortable standing height is a good way to go. The southern half of the tree usually has a little bit better flow, especially early in the season, because the southern half of the tree is what's going to be getting direct sunlight. And so you get kind of a longer period of the day that is above freezing. And it kind of like warms up more and faster. And so you get some more sap. Again, particularly early in the season, you don't see a lot of difference kind of by the end of the season. But if you have a nice sunny side of the tree, it's a good one to go for. Taps should be placed above, if taps are placed above like a large root of the tree or below a large branch, it also tends to have better flow, because you have more of that tissue, more tissue there that is going to be using the sap. And so there's more kind of flowing in that part of the trunk above and below. And then the whole should not, like if you're talking about doing this multiple years, kind of remember or look for where you have made holes in the past, and you shouldn't have a hole within 6 inches of a previous tap hole. You don't want to be doing it right next to the last one, because when the tree kind of heals over that wound, that little bit of tissue does not flow sap anymore. And so if you drill it right here, you're not going to get anywhere near as much sap from it as you did if you do it further away, so that all the tissue around it is allowing sap to come into it. And then use the mallet to tap the spile into the tree until it is nice and secure. You want to make sure it's actually going to stay in there, and that the sap is actually going to go into the spile as opposed to just coming out from around it. So you want to pound it in until it's nice and snug. But you also want to note, like kind of, and you'll feel it in the tree, you don't want to be in a situation where you're hitting it and it's hitting the back of the hole, because if you do that, you're then only getting sap from where the wound is kind of at the end of the tap, versus if there's a little gap there, then all of this tissue is weeping sap into that hole and then can come down the spile. And you'll notice that, and if you are having that situation where it's hitting the back of the hole, it means that you're not drilling your hole quite deep enough. And so you just want to, kind of remeasure, readjust your drill bit and just drill just a little bit deeper so that you're not getting that. The sap might be running immediately, or it might not. Every tree is different, and so you don't know. And then you hang the buckets or put on the tubing to the spile. And this is just a video of what maple and walnut a sap run usually looks like. And I'm hoping this will actually show up and it doesn't like jump around. But it's just like there was a drop, it's very slow, just drip. So yeah, hopefully you can see that. But that's more commonly what you're going to see. The birch is very unusual in that regard. And that doesn't look like a lot, but you tap that, you go home, you come back, the next day, and that bucket could be halfway full, all the way full. Those little drips add up over the hours. Oh, come on. And Sap Collection. So if you are, especially if you have hanging buckets, you then need to get that sap back to your house or wherever you're going to be boiling it or doing or consuming it or whatever. I tend to find the best way to do that is with big buckets. And sap should be treated similar to milk. If it's below freezing at night, like if it's getting below freezing at night and it's pretty cold, you don't need to collect sap every single day because it's not going to go bad that quickly. But if it's warm out, you don't want to leave it sitting outside for days and days, or it's going to start fermenting, going bad, getting gross. And that bacterial activity that makes it go gross, those bacteria are eating the sugar. So if you leave it sit out there when it's warm and you boil it down, you're not actually going to get as much syrup as if you harvested it quickly and got it into a situation where you're storing it in a cold situation or you're boiling it. So it should be collected and boiled or put into refrigerator or freezer, particularly if it's warm outside. Food grade 5-gallon buckets with lids are great for collecting, especially if you're needing to go a distance and kind of haul it in to a specific area. Having those is nice. And again, particularly with the lids, because it can splash and you lose it everywhere. But you can really use any kind of food grade container to hold the sap. And then syrup production. So in theory, essentially you're just boiling it down until it turns into syrup. Like that's literally all you're doing. You're just boiling it until it becomes syrup. That's the whole process. But there's a couple things that you kind of need to know, like, well, how do I know it's syrup? So just some numbers here. You need to boil off enough water to get the sugar concentration from 2% to 66%. So what that equates to is you're boiling off 97 to 99% of the water. So it's a lot of boiling. Producing maple syrup is a lot of boiling. That's really what it comes down to. So most of this boiling, you're just boiling for hours and hours and hours. And so it really doesn't take you don't really need to pay a whole lot of attention to it. it's boiling. You let it boil, make sure it doesn't, boil dry or anything, because then you have an unbelievable mess. Um, but so most of that boiling doesn't need a lot of attention. But when it starts getting kind of colored like this, like that's when you start like, okay, this is, and you can taste it. You can stick your finger in, like, oh, this is getting sweet, but it's still definitely not syrup. So that's when you want to be a little bit more careful, a little bit more aware. Um, and if you're just boiling, or if you just have like a few trees, like even in the past when I've done up to 10 trees, I usually find it is easiest to kind of boil everything down to where it's concentrated and then throw all this concentrate into the freezer. And then kind of at the end of the season, melting all of that like frozen concentrate and throwing it all in one big pan and boiling it down to syrup all at once. It's much easier to do that than trying to boil little tiny amounts of syrup. Because if you got this pot and there's like this much syrup in it, it's really hard to measure it to know if it's actually like the right concentration. You need enough to kind of fit into a cup so that you can get like a thermometer or a measuring device in there to test it. And so you need kind of a certain amount to do that easily. If you have a lot of trees, then do what you want. But if you're just talking about kind of like a home scale, backyard scale, a lot of that like boiling it down and then throwing it in the freezer is usually the easiest way to do it. So what the boiling means, there's a couple different ways to boil. And if you're doing like one tree, or you're just doing like a really small scale thing just to see how it is, you can boil inside. But if you're talking about like, actually doing a couple trees, I mean, with the boiling, what we're talking about is literally gallons of water that you are boiling off. And so putting gallons, like tens of gallons of water into the air in your house, not a great idea. You're going to start getting like paint peeling and like wood warping and things like that in your kitchen. And so it's usually good to boil outside. And that sounds cold and miserable. And if you just hate winter, maybe this is not the activity for you. But I find it as a great excuse for me to get outside and sit around something warm at a time that I don't really want to do that. But it like gets me outside, get some fresh air. It's nice. So an outdoor stove, turkey fryer, which is what this is, or what I have really moved to is a single induction burner, like those little like one single like kind of hot plate burners, but it's an induction top, so it doesn't actually get hot. Is now what I use for a lot of my boiling, and it's glorious because you plug it in, it doesn't actually get hot. You can set a timer on it to boil as long as you want, and then it will like automatically turn out. It's great. You don't have to worry about like a flame blowing out and stuff like that. So I have it where like if I'm at home, I'll like get up in the morning, I'll put it out there, and I'll come out every like 30 minutes to an hour just to check on it, add more stuff. But then otherwise, it's kind of self-regulating, which is nice. But a couple things is that sap boils faster the more surface area it has. So like a big wide pan is actually going to boil faster than like a skinny tall pan. And for me, at least, I prefer to fill up the pan, boil it down, and then fill it up again, as opposed to adding a little bit as it goes. I just find, just for my sanity, it's easier. Unless you just really want to sit out there and kind of sit around the fire all day, it's easier to just, kind of dump it in, let it boil down, dump more in, let it boil down, and continue. So as you're boiling, maple sap will foam when you boil it. Like when you first put in new sap, when it first comes to boil, it's going to produce a lot of foam. It's best to skim that off with like a little mesh strainer because it kind of like holds the steam in. It acts as like a little kind of insulation layer, and the steam can't escape as well. And what that foam is it's impurities that cause residue in the syrup. So you're not really like losing anything by doing that, and it allows it to boil faster. Once you get kind of that initial thing off, you're not really going to get more foam until you add more raw sap in. Walnut sap, on the other hand, can also foam, but what's unique about walnut sap is that there's actually pectin in the sap. And so as you boil it, that pectin will coagulate, and you'll get these little like white globby clumps of pectin that are in the syrup as you're boiling it. So again, kind of skim those out with a mesh strainer. You can theoretically dry it and use it as pectin to make like jam and stuff. I have never had enough for it to be worth my time to do that, but you can definitely do that. And if you find it works, let me know. And then birch is unique. Really, in my opinion, birch is better if you want to drink sap or cook with sap. For syrup, it's really kind of more trouble than it's worth, especially because there's not that many birch trees around here. It's also it's much more heat sensitive, and it can scorch in a way that maple and walnut do not. So if you just like boil it, it gets kind of like a bitter taste to it. So to like boil it off, you need to almost kind of simmer it, which then takes an unbelievable amount of time. Like it is just such a ridiculously slow process. There's another way to do it, which we'll talk about at the end, which is relatively expensive. So again, unless you're like real into it, wouldn't recommend it. But if it's done right, if you don't scorch it and you get it down, the syrup of birch tree actually has more of like a molasses flavor. It's not like a sweet, like maple syrup flavor. Walnut syrup kind of tastes a lot like maple syrup in my opinion. But birch really has more of like a molassesy flavor and is used a lot in like meat dishes and kind of savory dishes. So then the finish boiling. So you do kind of all that rough boiling, you have it concentrated down, but then that like last boiling to actually get it to syrup, that in my opinion is best done inside because you're around it. It's easier. Your stove is usually much more responsive than like an outside flame. So it's easier to kind of more finely finesse or slow down the boiling as you get closer to make sure you don't overboil it because you can burn the syrup. Like you can cook it too long and then it burns. And that is an unbelievable mess. And again, and things can happen really fast in these last stages. So again, if you think about it, to reduce the volume, like to boil, when you're boiling it down, you have to boil off half of the volume. Like if you put 2 gallons of sap in there, you need to boil off a full gallon of sap to go from 1% sugar to 2% sugar. But you only need to boil off 1% of the volume of the liquid to move from 65% to 66%, which is the point at which you reach syrup. So you need to be paying attention when you get to this. Is not a time to get distracted and go run around and do something else. Like when you're doing this finished boiling, this should be what you're doing. And you will need a candy thermometer or a hydrometer to test to know if you made it. There's some other ways that people talk about where they're like, oh, you can just do this, and this is like how the old timers did it. You can definitely try that, but especially if you're new to it and you want to make really sure, candy thermometers and hydrometers are really the like measuring items that you can use to know, did I hit this spot? So that when you put it in your jars, you know it's not going to mold, which is what happens if you didn't boil it quite long enough, is it'll mold. And that's a big bummer. And as you, again, are getting close, you want to make sure that you're boiling slowly. And as you start getting really close, it will start bubbling a lot. Like like bubbling like this and can like overflow if you're boiling too fast. Some people will add like a little bit of butter to control the bubbling. You can also just stir it, which is what I do. Partially because butter makes me very sick, but also because I don't want butter in my syrup. So it is then syrup when the temperature reaches 218 degrees, or the Brix reading on the hydrometer is between 66 and 68. So hydrometer is what I like to use because it's very accurate at measuring this. The candy thermometers are nice, and if you have one already, definitely go for it. But like the exact temperature you need depends on your elevation. And we're pretty close to sea level, but we're not sea level. So you just would want to check the numbers to make sure wherever you're at that your elevation is that you're gonna have the right temperature to, depending on the elevation, blah, blah, blah. But the hydrometers are not affected by elevation in that same way, which is nice. And they're not that expensive. I think they're like $20 for a hydrometer. And then storing. So as you do the finish boiling, all of those minerals, that calcium, that magnesium, that silica, the potassium, all those things that were in the sap that we talked about early on are going to start precipitating. They're going to start turning into solid minerals out of the sap as you approach that syrup stage. When it's really hot, it's not going to precipitate. You're not going to notice it in the syrup as you're boiling it. But what that results in eventually as it cools is it's going to coagulate into this material called niter, or sugar sand that is this like gritty mineral sand-like material that will accumulate at the bottom of your jars. So that's what you see here is this bottom stuff. So it's just minerals. It's fine to have, but if you see that, that's what it is. Your syrup didn't go bad. That's just what happens. If you don't like that or you don't want to do that, you can buy these like special filters that you pour the sap through as it's hot, and it will kind of filter those things out. I don't do that just because I don't want to, basically. But you can do that if you really want like a nice clear maple syrup type product. But again, you will get that if you don't filter it. And then pour it into a sealed container, making sure that that sealed container is not, cold, and then you pour a boiling liquid in it. Otherwise, if it's glass, it will shatter. And then you can can it. Like if you're into canning, just make sure you look up the right amount of time to boil it and blah, blah, blah. Or especially if you're just talking about a couple jars, just throw it in the fridge until you're ready to eat it. And then you won't need to worry about any other health or safety stuff. The niter, the sugar sand in there, can be eaten. It's kind of gritty and weird, but it does have like syrup in it, so it is still sweet. I know some people will like take it out with like a knife and like spread it on butter or spread it on bread and kind of eat it. Or if you don't like it, it's mineral content, so you can throw it in your compost or you can add it to your garden, and it's basically a mineral fertilizer. But then cleaning up. Once the sap is no longer running or the trees have budded or whatever and you're done for the year, you want to remove and wash the buckets and or tubing, pull the spiles out of the tree with pliers, hammer, crowbar, whatever kind of thing to pull it out depending on the type of spile you have. Spiles do not stay in the tree. So this is a question I get. You don't leave it in the tree. You are removing it so that wound can heal, and then you are tapping a new hole next year. And you do not need to do anything to that hole. Don't put anything in it. Don't cover it. Don't do anything like that. Because like if you do that, there's actually potentially a higher chance of a disease or something going wrong with it. So you pull the spile out, let the tree do its thing, and it will heal itself. So I've got a couple slides here that are just some other things that you can kind of try. So everything we talked about up to this point is like the basics of how to do it. But there's some other things that, like, if you dive into it, you're reading books, you're reading stuff online, you'll hear about a couple other things that I just wanted to touch on here, just so you know that they exist, that it's a thing. So one is freezing sap. This is a thing that people like get really, really intense about and debate about a lot in like online groups and stuff, or if you talk to people. So the idea is basically if you freeze sap, some of it will freeze, not all of it will freeze unless the temperature is cold enough. And there's some people who say like, well, the frozen stuff has no sugar in it, so you throw it away and then you basically have reduced your amount of boiling. And that is partially true, but partially not. The ice does have sugar in it, but it is a pretty small amount. And so you do lose some sugar, but the stuff that's left over is more highly concentrated, so there is less boiling. So it's like a whole debate as to like, is it worth it? Is it not? It's up to you. Do your own tests. But there's kind of two ways to do it. So if you have your bucket like this one that it's on the tree, it freezes the night before, and there's a chunk of ice in your sap, you can like take this ice out and measure, and the liquid that's in there is a higher sugar concentration. Like that is true. But if you then take the ice and melt it, you will also find sugar in there. But it's like 0.7% sugar. Like it's very low in the ice. So you will lose some. But if it's partially frozen, you can do that, where you throw away the ice. It will reduce your amount of boiling, and maybe that's fine. It'll save you a lot of time with boiling. If, however, the whole thing freezes, because the whole thing will freeze if it's cold enough. If it's frozen solid, something that you can do is you can wait until about a third of it melts. And that first third of it melts is going to be the stuff that has the most sugar in it. And you do kind of the same thing. Wait till the first third melts, throw the rest of the ice away. The stuff that's left over is going to be a pretty high sugar concentration. So it's the same idea. But again, you will lose some sugar. So just like, I don't know, sometimes people get really upset about that. Just so you know, that's a thing. So another thing is reverse osmosis system. So people talk about this a lot. Commercial operations use these a lot because they can save an unbelievable amount of time and energy in terms of boiling the syrup. If you're just talking about a couple trees in your backyard, it's probably not going to be worth it. But like big commercial operations or larger scale hobbyists really like reverse osmosis systems. So the idea is it's the same like reverse osmosis system that is used to purify water, but you're basically doing the opposite. You are running it through, and the like extra super pure water you're kind of throwing away because you're taking that pure water off and you're then concentrating the sugar in the sap that's left. And you can kind of run it through a couple times, and you can usually take it up to about 8% sugar doing that. So what that amounts to is you're usually removing about 75% of the water without having to boil it. So what that means is a couple things. It means one, you can reduce your boiling time by 75%, or it can mean that you can tap 4 times as many trees and boil them down in the same amount of time, which is what I did, because I did get one of these for Christmas. And there's small scale ones that you can get. So I went from tapping 10 trees to 40 trees this last year because I got one of these nifty little tiny machines. They make really big ones. If you're looking to do this, and again, I wouldn't recommend this unless you're really wanting to do like 30, 40 plus trees at a minimum. They are a fair amount of maintenance, and again, they're not cheap, but compared to the time and the effort of boiling, they can be worth it. If you're wanting to do this on a small scale, the company that I have found that I really like, and the one that I personally purchased, is called the RO Bucket. It was actually started by a science teacher who wanted to do maple syrup production in his school as an educational experience, and it worked really well. So he now is like making kits for people. I looked into like building my own, and it was still cheaper to buy a pre-made kit from this company, and I've had pretty good luck, and they have really good customer service. And then last, you will also hear about vacuum pumps. This is something that I cannot say would make any sense for a backyard person to do. But that is a thing that exists. That's literally where you have to do tubing. And then at the end of all the tubing, there's literally a vacuum pump that is creating a vacuum. This can increase the amount of sap that is coming out of a tree by like 50 to 200%. So you can get significantly more production from it, but it means you have to do tubing, and you have to have electricity, and you have to have a pump that's running all the time. And that's a lot for someone. If you're just talking about your backyard, probably doesn't make any sense. But related to that, and the main reason I mention it, is you will find a lot of things online where people talk about other trees that you can make syrup from. And there are many other trees that people make syrup from or have made syrup from, really only in the modern age though. And that is because most of them only work consistently if you have a vacuum system. So when you hear people talking, and like you'll find things online where people talking about making syrup, and people sell syrup made from sycamore and beech and basswoods and lindens and hawthorn beams and sweet gums. They are doing that with a vacuum system. So if you drill a hole, and I say this out of experience because I have done this with sycamores and sweet gums just to see, you get no sap. You need a vacuum pump to really get that. You'll also find some people selling things called hickory syrup. That is not made from sap. That is a simple syrup that you make like with cane sugar, and then you boil the bark of hickory in it to give it like a kind of hickory flavor. So that's a completely different thing, but you'll hear people talking about hickory syrup as well. And we've got one more class for the year. It's just my last little plug here. So December 14th, we're doing an in-person class at our office that's about growing fruit from winter cuttings. So we're talking about like rooting your own cuttings to produce fruit next year. And that's actually going to be guest taught by Jessica Blessing Patterson with Dig Annuals and Perennials, who is the person who grows our vegetable seedlings and has been working with us to propagate our fruit trees, which is why that's what she's talking about. So thank you, everybody. I hope that was helpful and that you have lots of luck tapping your own trees.